My tires were getting very old. The rubber was all dried out, and it was pretty clear that I could have a blowout at any time. But really, there is very rarely a blowout. There probably almost never needs to be one. Before you have that blowout, there's usually a slow leak or an increasingly thin or weak spot in the tire somewhere, and it's usually very discernible. And that would be the case here in the story about Peter. Peter appears to have a blowout. In fact, his pride has been setting him up for some time for this particular occasion. And he learns today a painful lesson. Now, our passage is a little longer than usual today, and it basically has two main parts. The trials, and we're only going to get through the first three phases, and then the denials, and there are three denials by the Apostle Peter. They are interspersed here in this text that Benji just read, so I'm going to separate them and deal first with the trials and then with the denials. And next week, Lord willing, we'll get back into a lot more detail about the trials, most particularly Jesus appearing before Pilate. John gives us more detail than any of the Gospels about his encounter with Pilate. Both today and next week we'll be looking at that with some care. There are a couple of things for you to be watching as we work our way through all of this. First of all, in all of these trials, I want you to take notice of the illegalities. At every level, things are done wrongly, not done according to either Jewish law or Roman law. And it's a rush job. It's an attempt to create a case where one doesn't exist. And there are numerous illegalities along the way. Another thing to be watching for, and we'll deal with this a little bit today, is the questions that Pilate asks. I wish that we had a recording of this, because there are two ways to read every one of these questions. If we could hear the tone of voice, it would help us to understand better, perhaps, what is actually happening here. Now, you can read every one of these questions in one of two different ways, a positive and a negative way, and that depends very largely on your preconceived idea of what's going on here. You can read this as Pilate is just cynical and crass and get this thing done with, and he's not guilty, but I don't care, let's do it anyway. Or you can read the same questions with a genuine sense of some awe, something going on in Pilate's understanding, some change in his way of thinking through here. I won't be able to deal with all of that today. I'll mention it a couple times as we work our way through, but next week I hope to be able to sort through that. Whether or not we can come to a conclusion, I would have to say that I have gone from one extreme to the other extreme and maybe come back somewhere into the middle on that. But wait for next week for that. So today, let's begin with what our text has to tell us about the trials. And that actually begins in the text from last week, verse 12. Jesus is bound and then taken to Annas. In the process of going to Annas, there are already a couple of illegal actions here. First of all, it's an illegal arrest, and he's being taken before a very prejudiced judge. The judge in this case should have excused himself and called for a different judge, which he does do in a moment here, but it's no great improvement. So first of all, back in verse 12, as we saw last week, Jesus is bound. The Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And we saw that a cohort is a spira, that is generally 600 people, but there is some literary evidence for a portion of a cohort, something that is known as a maniple, consisting of about 200 soldiers, to still be called this same word, cohort. Now, that means, though, that there are somewhere between 200 and 600 Roman soldiers involved in this. And as I suggested last week, that's probably more than what you originally pictured as far as the group that's arresting Jesus and walking out to the Garden of Gethsemane and back again to Annas' house. The commander is specifically mentioned here, and it's a military term, something along the position of colonel. And that, along with the number involved here, led me to conclude that Pilate was very much aware of this group that's going out for the arrest at night. So when things start to open in the morning at sunlight, Pilate is not unaware of what's been taking place through the night. The officers here are specifically the officers of the Jews. Those would be probably some of the members of the Sanhedrin, and they have bound Jesus, and they're now going to take him into the city and begin a kind of a pre-dawn trial to establish some kind of a basis for the arrest and be able to present that to Pilate and the Roman authorities. So just taking a quick look at the map involved here, this is an aerial photograph. You can see the location of the Garden of Gethsemane, upper right-hand corner, which is outside the walled city of Jerusalem. It's on the other side of the Kidron Valley, and last week we saw how Jesus and his disciples crossed down through the Kidron to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, a place where Jesus frequented, and therefore Judas knew exactly where to go to find him. They're taken into Annas' residence, and there's some question about where exactly that might be. Archaeologists have discovered and have a wonderful display now open to the public of a palatial mansion, that's their terminology, which they relate to the priests and priestly activity. Part of the reason for that identification is the multiple mikvaot, or ritual immersion baths, in this one building. Rather larger than usual dining room or meeting hall, and some other elements that led them to conclude that this was some sort of a religious palace. And their suggestion, and I think it's a good one, is that this is actually where the priests would reside when it was their turn to come into Jerusalem and serve in the temple. All of the priests were scattered in various parts of the country, but they would come up to Jerusalem for a 2-week period of service. Remember the story of Zechariah when he comes into Jerusalem and it's revealed to him that the birth of the Savior and the birth of John, who is the forerunner of the Savior, that happens during his 2-week stint in Jerusalem. He may very well have been located in this palatial building as well. In just a couple verses here, we're going to see that he is led from Annas' residence to Caiaphas' residence. It could very well be the same building, but there is a traditional site for Caiaphas' house. It's owned by the Armenian Church, and it's just outside the present-day southern wall of Jerusalem, just outside of Zion Gate, if you're familiar with the area. And then before we're done today, and John doesn't give us all the details here, but there is another site to the south of the town, which is today called St. Peter in Gallicantu. Gala is the word for rooster, and kantar is the verb for sing. The rooster sings. This is the traditional site of Peter's hearing the rooster crow and going out and weeping bitterly. So we're kind of gathered around here at the southern extremity of the walled city, both at the time of Christ and as we can see it today from the aerial view here. So first of all, Jesus is bound, but beginning now in our text today, he is bullied. In verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Now, it's not as though he didn't already have a pretty good idea of this. They have questioned Jesus before. In fact, on the basis of his teaching, they have been hounding him and seeking to arrest him on several occasions. They've already hatched a plot to murder him. And we've been told that several times throughout the Gospel of John. So this is to get it down in the record And I think there is a slightly different twist here when he questions him also about his disciples. His teaching was that he was the Messiah, he was the King of the Jews, that if they could somehow see that he is raising some sort of a rabble or an army of some sort and becomes a threat to Rome, then they would have a solid political case. That does come in subsequent verses here, but at this moment it's more of a theological question than a political question. The political charges will come later. Again, remember the illegalities here. This is a pre-dawn questioning. There was not to be any legal proceedings before sunrise. And in this question, there is an attempt to induce self-incrimination, to get the person being charged to say things that could then be turned and used against him. So Jesus' answer is very significant here. He's answered him, he said, "I've spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret." Interestingly, Jesus doesn't answer at this point the question about his disciples, but on the contrary, he 3 times uses an emphatic I. In the Greek grammar, it's not necessary to use that pronoun because it's embedded in the verbs that are used here. But by including the pronoun each time, he's putting strong emphasis. I did this. I did this. I didn't do that. Notice he speaks about his manner of teaching. It was openly. He speaks about his audience. He spoke to the world, and specifically to all the Jews. He speaks about his location here. It's in the synagogues and openly in the temple. And he speaks about the content of his teaching. He taught nothing in secret. In other words, there were not 2 kinds of content here, one for his disciples and one for public consumption. He was entirely open in what he said. Now, he takes that another step, and we see that frequently here now in each of these trials. He's the one that's supposed to be answering the questions, but in each case, he turns around with some questions of his own. As he does here, he says, "Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said." Again, there is an illegality involved here, and I think Jesus is calling attention to that. In that by Jewish law, they were not supposed to open any kind of questioning without witnesses present. And the first witnesses that were supposed to be called were character witnesses, friendly witnesses to say, this person is decent, this person is upright. So Jesus is calling attention to that as he, in this case, says, why don't you have any witnesses available here? Not only did they not have any witnesses to bring accusations, they didn't have the necessarily required character witnesses as well. So he's bound, he's bullied, and then beginning at verse 22, he is buffeted as well. And that's, before we're done, going to turn to outright beating. Verse 22, when he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" We're not sure who this person is, but it is probably one of the Roman arresting officers that would have no doubt been standing next to him to make sure he didn't try to make a break for freedom or something. And he is the one who identifies Annas as the high priest, whereas in just a couple verses we're going to find out that it's Caiaphas who is the high priest at that time. Now, that could be confusing. It is politically confusing with the first century because Annas was the high priest, and by Jewish law, that was a lifelong position. He should never have left that before his death. However, the Romans didn't like that and didn't like the way Annas was such a mafia boss, and so they had deposed him, and in rather quick succession, 4 of his sons had become high priests. And then now, at this point, year 33, Caiaphas, his son-in-law, is the actual high priest. But I think we can probably forgive this Roman officer for not understanding all the intricacies of the Jewish high priesthood here. The word for struck means a sharp blow with the flat of his hand. So this would be a slap, not necessarily a punch. And in many cultures, certainly in the Middle East, that's a very degrading sort of punishment, to be slapped as opposed to being punched out. Now, unlike Paul later, and that story is recorded in Acts 23, Paul is also struck for, in that case, though, cursing the priest, the high priest. Paul called him a whitewashed wall. In other words, a dirty piece of work daubed with whitewash to preserve appearances. And Paul is struck also for his words, but in his case, he had cursed the high priest, and Jesus did not do the same. So we have next, Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me?" Do I detect here a tone of anger in his voice? I think so. It's definitely under control, but this is entirely illegal and wrong in every way, what's going on this occasion. And I think perhaps a proof of this is Jesus didn't turn the other cheek. He's struck on one side, but he doesn't turn the other cheek here. And I liked Don Carson's comment on that particular aspect. He said, turning the other cheek without bearing witness to the truth is not the fruit of moral resolution, but the terrorized cowardice of the wimp. And that's one of the things that strikes me all the way through the trials and Jesus' response. Before each one of them, he stands up straight and tall. He takes it on the chin, and much worse. And yet he is clear in his answers, and he turns it right around to questioning the questioner, as he does on this occasion. Now, beginning at verse 24, he is sent from there to Caiaphas, and the text says Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. He no doubt realizes that he's getting nowhere with him in this line of questioning. And now the line of questioning is going to turn to, are you the Son of God? Which, of course, is what got him in trouble already back in earlier chapters. And what they picked up stones to throw at him previously, and now they're turning to the deeper theological question here. He made himself out to be God. Again, take a look at some of the movement here. I've given you a little drawing of the palatial mansion. It's part of 5 or more buildings or houses from the first century in what is called the Herodian Quarter. And specifically here, this is the one that the archaeologists have identified perhaps as related to the priests. On site, there's a beautiful little model of it, which is easy to be able to locate some of the details. You can see on the left side here the street. That would have been where Peter and the others walked down as they entered the building. Peter and John apparently, or Peter is stopped at the door. You can see where the entrance is here, lower half of the picture. And you can see the central courtyard, which would have been open to the air in the middle. The larger reception hall at the back, where presumably some of this questioning might have been taking place. Now, we don't know for certain, but it's got decent archaeological backing that this could be exactly the very spot of this encounter with Annas. The question is then, is Caiaphas residing in this same building in separate quarters, he also being a priest, or is he in a separate house? And traditionally, Caiaphas' house has been located outside of the city wall, and you can see once again the positioning then of Annas' residence and Caiaphas' residence. And I use that word rather than house since we're not sure in either case that it might be their permanent residence. He's sent to Caiaphas, and the denials of Peter, there's some question. Do they take place in Annas' house or in Caiaphas' house? John seems to locate them in Annas' house. But remember, the other Gospels don't refer to this appearance before Annas, and so in those accounts, it all sounds like it's happening at Caiaphas' house. In fact, if you compare the different Gospel accounts, there is some question about how many people asked Peter and how many times he denied the Lord. The fact in Jesus' prediction was, "You will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." That does not exclude he could have denied him 10 times before the rooster crowed. He did, in fact, deny him 3 times, and if you compare the different witnesses and the ones that are asking the question, it certainly sounds like it may have happened on several different occasions. Some of them around the courtyard, at least one of them at the doorway entrance here. Again, a couple of illegalities are going on at this point. First of all, the trial now is beginning while it's still dark. And that was so that they could give the Sanhedrin time enough to convene. And being a holiday and Pilate being in town, no doubt the court system was jammed up with all kinds of things scheduled. And so they make every effort to try to get their foot in the door over there at the Praetorium, the location where Pilate is, at the crack of dawn. So that means all of these things have been taking place since the midnight arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. And by the way, before the day is done, Jesus is already going to be crucified, and that was against Jewish law as well. They were never supposed to have the trial and the sentencing and the execution in a day's time. There was supposed to be a space of time between those events. Let's take a look then at, by the way, this is the photograph of what remains of a church that never was finished over the site of Caiaphas' house. It's not open to the public, but if you get up on the old city wall, you can look over the edge and see the Armenian property there and locate where possibly these events took place as well. So let's take a look at his trial now before Pilate, and that begins at verse 28 and will take us down through 40, and then we'll go back and look at Peter's denials. And once again, with Pilate, John has a lot more detail than any of the other Gospels, so we want to take adequate time with this consideration. First of all is the accusation, or the lack thereof, I guess you could say, verses 28 through 32. And again, I want to call your attention to the questions that Pilate asks throughout this encounter. Verse 28, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the Praetorium, and it was early." Now, the "they" would in this case be the Jewish authorities, perhaps a Roman contingent to accompany it, but this is now the high priests, Caiaphas, and the Jewish authorities presenting him before Pilate. And the Praetorium is probably to be identified with what is also called the Antonia Fortress, built by King Herod and named for Anthony, as in Anthony and Cleopatra, one of his friends who later he betrayed and wasn't so friendly. But the Antonia Fortress was the likely position of the Roman soldiers, the Praetorium, and the residents of Pilate when he would come up to Jerusalem. He lived down in Caesarea, but he would come up to Jerusalem to judge cases and deal with local issues. The other possibility is he may have been located in Herod's palace, which was no longer occupied by Herod. And since we'll be looking at a little bit more of those details next week, I'm going to save some of that for later. So at this point, the suggestion is this is the Praetorian Guard. You notice it's just on the north corner of the Temple Mount. So they've crossed through the city, the heart of the city, to get over here to meet with Pilate. They themselves did not enter into the Praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Now, a couple of things going on here. First of all, the Passover meal itself was the night before. So eating the Passover in this regard means the continuing celebration. This is a week long, 8 days. There's 1 day of Passover, and there are the 7 days then of unleavened bread. And that's a very critical time for Jewish people because they are not to be found with any leaven in their place of residence. And since this is a Gentile house, the fear would be you could go in there and maybe sit down on the couch and get some cracker crumbs off of the sofa and carry them back to your house with you, and then you would be condemned for not keeping kosher during unleavened bread. So to avoid defilement, says they did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled. That's almost ludicrous. Here they are plotting the murder of the Lord of glory, and they're worried about ceremonial defilement. But they didn't go inside. And you can just imagine some of the drama and the politics here with Pilate. He's not happy about this Jewish rabble that he has to deal with all the time and all these internal conflicts and problems. And now they won't even come into the judgment hall. He's got to go out to meet them. So Pilate went out to them and he said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Now, he's accommodating them by going out to them. It's early in the morning. He probably just got up himself. And he's already met with the first legal questions of the day. And he has to go out to the gate or the outside to speak with them about their this trial that they want. Actually, they don't want a trial. They want just to have a quick condemnation. And his very question here is significant in that he asked, and this is a very, very legitimate question, what is your accusation against him? Of course, that would be the first thing that any judge must know to try any sort of a case. And notice their horrible response. They don't have any accusation, nothing that would possibly stand before the Roman court. They're not about to say to him, well, he thinks he's God. That would get thrown out just like it did in a similar instance in Acts chapter 12. A few years later, Proconsul Gallio threw them out of court for a charge of blasphemy brought against Paul. That's one of your problems. You guys deal with it. And that's exactly the same thing that Pilate says here. But notice their answer. If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. That's direct evasion of the question itself. They don't have an answer. And they're just looking for a rubber stamp conviction at this point. Now, probably, as I've suggested, Pilate knew about some of what went on the night before. He probably released that Roman cohort to be able to go out for the arrest. He probably had been apprised of the arrest itself and probably knew in advance that the group was knocking at his front door. So he is asking the first legitimate question here, what accusation do you bring against this man? When they respond as they do, he says to them, well, you take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. In Matthew chapter 27, we have just a slight more detail. In verse 18, Pilate, knew that it was because of envy that they had handed him over. There's no criminal case here for me to judge, he's saying. So you judge him. And again, it's very significant, the response that they give, because this is more than just a Roman or Jewish political judicial question. There is also a theological issue at the base of this. Their response is, we are not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Now he had said, and if I be lifted up, will draw all men to me. That lifting up he spoke to indicate what manner of death he was about to die. Here's the same phrase again, and that is a direct reference to crucifixion. By Jesus' word, and of course this is by messianic prophecy, going back to Psalm 22, Psalm 110, Isaiah 53. He was going to be crucified, though at the time those prophecies were written, crucifixion didn't yet exist. This was a horrible Roman means of execution, invented just in time by God's providence for this specific occasion. And so what kind of death he was about to die, it had to be by lifting up, i.e., by crucifixion. And the Romans were the only ones that could do that. The Jewish people, on a very limited basis, for blasphemy specifically, were allowed to stone a blasphemer. They still had to have permission from Rome to do so, but they did not crucify. They did not lift up. They cast down. And they did that, of course, in just a few days' time in the case of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. We're not permitted to put anyone to death. This he said to indicate what kind of death he was about to die. This is, in fact, then, a fulfillment of biblical prophecy with regard to this specific occasion. So that's the accusation that is not brought and that Pilate very justly calls for here. Let's take a look then at the examination that follows, verses 33 through 40. 33 through 40. It takes place, we presume, in the Praetorium courtyard. So Pilate goes back into where Jesus is now bound in the Praetorium. That means Pilate is shuttling back and forth for this. Another inconsistency with one who is supposed to be the ruler of the region, but he is he's so bound by the political sensibilities, in this case the religious sensibilities of the Jewish population. So he goes back in and he asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, before we look at that, just think about it this way. Jesus was, in fact, Pilate's king. Forget the Jews, forget anybody else. He is the King of Kings over all and every one of us. And here is Pilate, a measly Roman official, asking him a question like this. And again, the tone of voice that you put into this can result in two completely different views about Pilate's attitude here. Are you the king of the Jews? Or are you the king of the Jews? Now, Pilate certainly knew enough about Jewish theology to know the messianic stories. Messianic expectation was high in the first century. He had no doubt dealt with it on numerous occasions, as did all of the Roman governors hereafter. The expectation, of a Messiah. Is Pilate asking here, are you just the messianic king, or are you a king for the Jews? That would turn it into a political question. If he were a political king, then a case could be made for some kind of plot against Rome. And of course, if that were the case, then Pilate would be able to proceed rather easily with what the Jews wanted him to do. It's an attempt to obtain some kind of a political charge against Jesus, and I think that Jesus' answer is all the more significant because of that. Notice how Jesus responds. And here again, the questioner, or the one questioned, is turning around and making the questions. Jesus says, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" The synoptics have this part of the conversation just a little bit different. They say, "It is as you say." Now, that word is used in this text down in verse 37. Exact same construction. John's wording of this particular question is a question rather than a statement. Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Now, his next phrase, or his next question on the part of Pilate is, I'm not a Jew, am I? And again, depending on how you tone your voice there, you could make that be a very sarcastic question. I'm not a Jew, am I? That would be the common reading of Christianity for the last 2,000 years, which has been largely characterized by anti-Semitism. Or you could say like this. Let me read that phrase again. I'm not a Jew, am I? It's your own nation and the chief priest that delivered you here to me. What have you done? It could very well be a genuine question here, and without that tone of sarcasm. By the way, this whole phrase, Pilate's words here, are a strong reminder of exactly what John has told us all the way back in chapter 1, verse 11. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. Now, Jesus' answer here is of very great importance. My kingdom is not of this world. So there's the quick, immediate response to what Pilate has to know. I'm not setting up a kingdom here against Rome. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. And that change in word is significant here. He is not denying that his kingdom would be an earthly kingdom, because in fact it will be. When he comes back to the earth, sets up his throne in Jerusalem, and rules for 1,000 years, that is a very, very earthly kingdom, not to be allegorized or spiritualized away. Neither is he saying, well, my kingdom is just a spiritual rule of God over the hearts of people. He's not saying that. He is certainly saying my kingdom is not a present threat to Rome. In fact, his kingdom at this point was postponed due to Israel's unbelief. But he doesn't go into all the details of that explanation. He answers very honestly, very straightforwardly, Pilate's question. Now, Pilate's next question is, again, of great interest here. So, you are a king. That could be, what kind of a king are you? You don't even have an army. Or it could be a serious question. What kind of a king are you then? So you are a king. Pilate didn't understand the theology, but he did understand that Jesus was still claiming that he had a kingdom. Jesus' response, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born. That's his humanity. And for this I have come into the world. That's his deity. You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. John is the one that told us back in chapter 14, in Jesus' words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes unto the Father except by me. Merrill Tenney says, Jesus' words were an invitation for Pilate to listen to him and to learn the truth. Jesus showed more interest in appealing to Pilate than in defending himself. And so Pilate's next question is, and here we go again, what's the tone of voice? What's truth? Was it just pure cynicism? A guy who had seen it all and didn't believe in anything anymore? Or was it an honest question? What is truth? He may very well have been asking for more from the Lord at this point. Was it a despairing question? Was it an impatient question? This thing could go on forever. Was it some other kind of sincere question? The answer comes when he had said this, he went out again, Pilate, went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. Now, John condenses the events right here, and he completely omits the trial before Herod Antipas. It's at this point, according to the synoptics, that Pilate learns that Herod is in town, and so he sends Jesus over to Herod. And that we'll take a look at briefly next week in our summary. But John omits that part of the story. Here's what Luke has to say about that in Luke chapter 23, verses 14 through 16. You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he has sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. Pilate is quite conclusive in the way that he states that repeatedly. There is no cause here. There is no guilt. There is no charge to be brought against him. And he repeats it several times over. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Now he's back outside of the praetorium addressing the waiting Jewish leaders. And here is his next question. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews? Again, what is the tone of voice that is used here? Is he saying, you want me to give you your king? And just kind of an in-your-face. They had rejected him. The leadership there had rejected him. And is he just kind of prodding them? Or is he saying, do you want to receive your Messiah here? Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? They cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. The word that's used there for robber is one who seizes plunder. And the Synoptic Gospels actually use a little bit different word. They call him an insurrectionist, which probably is related to the Zealots who were fighting against Rome. And they had committed murder and insurrection. They were a proven enemy of Rome. But he was popular among the people, like Jesus, but for different reasons. And so they asked for his release. Now, in the time remaining, let's take a quick look at Peter's denials here, beginning with the first one, which goes back to verse 15. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now, that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest, but Peter was standing at the door outside. This other disciple is not identified for us, and that's fairly characteristic of John. He doesn't ever call himself by name. He speaks of himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, or something similar to that. So most have concluded that this is probably John. The question is, how is he related then to the priests? How could he possibly be related to Annas or Caiaphas? And so some have suggested this might be another disciple, maybe Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, disciples of Jesus who were known to the high priest. As a matter of fact, John would have been known to the high priest because John's father, John is related to the priestly line, and he may have been in and out of a place like that on previous occasions. The court here is an outside courtyard, or something that's open to the sky. So we're told the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. John's mother was Salome. She was Mary's sister, and thus related by marriage to Elizabeth. Elizabeth's husband was Zechariah, a priest. So there is a link there between these people and John and the high priest. Now, notice here, it's a slave girl at the door. Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now, that would be a very legitimate question. And by the way, this is asked expecting a negative answer. She's the doorkeeper. She doesn't want any of the enemy inside. She said, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" Expecting a negative answer. So expecting a negative answer plus being a female doorkeeper, it should have been very easy for Peter to say no. Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves, and Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. It takes place here in the courtyard. And I want you to jot down in your memory that word, charcoal fire, because it only appears 2 times in the entire New Testament, both of them here in John. This is the first place. And the other place is in chapter 21. Again, Peter, in this case, finding Jesus cooking the fish over a charcoal fire. And that smell brought back those memories of just a few days previous when Peter had been warming himself at a similar charcoal fire. The chill of spring nights in Jerusalem must have kept them huddled together, and that's where we find him. His second denial, jump down to verse 25, Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, "You're not also one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." Again, the way this question is phrased in Greek, it expects a negative answer. No, I'm not. Notice it does say they asked him. I think that would open the door for some of the variants that we find in the other Gospels of who's asking the questions. Here, it sounds like there were multiple people perhaps asking the same thing. Notice that in this progression, Peter has walked in the counsel of the ungodly. He's inside the door. He's now standing in the way of sinners. He's there warming himself at the same fire. And he will soon sit in the seat of the scornful, the very progression we read of in Psalm 1. The third denial is in verses 26 and 27. One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Now this question expects a positive answer. It's kind of hard to get away from where you've got a relative who saw him asking the question. "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. "I saw you, didn't I?" From a relative of Malchus. It now moves from suspicion to reasonable certainty here. And for Peter, there is now the very additional risk of not just of being present in that wrong place, but being charged with attempted murder. Jesus had predicted this already in chapter 13, verse 38. Let me read for you Luke 22, 61 and 62 about this third denial. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. And you know how it is in a crowded space, a lot of people, a lot of noise, things going on. But sometimes you can just turn and catch the eye of an individual. And that's what happens here. The Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told them, "Before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Let me give you some observations by way of conclusion. First of all, in Matthew chapter 26, thinking about Peter, in the upper room, which we've been looking at in the previous chapters here in John, Peter boasted 3 times in Matthew 26 that he would remain true. He says, even if everyone falls away, even if I have to die, I'm ready to go with you to prison. And then he yielded to the devil. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we just read about it here in John, but in Mark chapter 14, Peter went to sleep 3 times. 3 times the Lord goes and comes back and finds Peter and the others sleeping there when they should have been praying. Peter yielded to the flesh. In Annas courtyard, here in John 18, Peter denied the Lord 3 times. In doing so, he yielded to the world. So he yields to the world, the flesh, and the devil. And that is his way of attacking us and coming at us. But thankfully, this story is going to go on to chapter 21. In chapter 21, by the Sea of Galilee, Peter 3 times confessed his love for Christ, meaning he repented and he gave himself to the Lord. William Barclay says, it was the real Peter who protested his loyalty in the upper room. It was the real Peter who drew his lonely sword in the moonlight of the garden. It was the real Peter who followed Jesus because he could not leave his Lord alone. It was not the real Peter who cracked beneath the tension and who denied his Lord. And that is just what Jesus could see. The forgiving love of Jesus is so great that he sees our real personality not in our faithlessness, but in our loyalty. Not in our defeat by sin, but in our reaching after goodness, even when we are defeated. Peter sinned. He sinned miserably. But Peter repented of his sin. And Peter was brought back into fellowship and great service for the Lord. And that's a great promise and example for all of us. Let's pray. Thank you again, Father, for recording so many details of this story so that we can read it and go back to it and ponder it. There are still many imponderables in what we've just looked at today. And yet there is such a strong, clear encouragement to us to be faithful to you, to not give in to the temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Thank you for the story of our dear Savior, what he did, what he suffered, and the great pain that was soon to come upon him, not the physical, but the bearing the burden of the sin of this whole world, my sin. That was the most shuddering aspect of the cross that he had to face. And I thank you that he was willing to do that he died in my place, and that he has provided us salvation for those who will believe. May we do so in Jesus' name. Amen. God be with you until we meet again.